my personal opinion, we were created to not be alone. We were created to be in relationships.
My friend was like, well, why don't we just put some games in the back and we can do like a, low-key game cafe. We had over 600 people show up to our opening day.
Like, if I am lonely and if I've struggled with this my whole life, what does that say about God's presence in my life?
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, what can we do about loneliness in America? Charlotte Donlin never really thought of herself as a lonely person. That started to change, though, after grad school.
I had a book proposal that I sent to an acquisitions editor.
Donlin is a spiritual director and a writer based in Alabama.
And he loved it, and he took it to his team, and half of the people were for it and half of the people were against it, and the no's won. And when he brought it back to me and told me what, their decision, one thing he said was, "We didn't know what to do with you." He didn't mean it in a negative way, but that sentence really struck a core kind of experience for me. Like, a lot of people don't know what to do with me. And whenever I experience rejection of some sort professionally, or even my experiences in church, I feel like I'm on the periphery. And I kind of feel like every area of life, I'm kind of an oddball.
She couldn't quite name the feeling at first, though, because it wasn't just rejection. It seemed like something a little bigger, more familiar. And then she realized,
oh, I know this feeling. Like, I think it's loneliness, and I think I've felt this way my entire life.
She's not alone. U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy wrote in his parting prescription for the country that he was worried about how exhausted and alone Americans are generally. He pointed to the 2023 advisory report that he'd issued, naming loneliness an epidemic with serious public health consequences. Research shows social disconnection is about as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and more harmful than obesity. The depth of loneliness in America caught him off guard, said Dr. Murthy, because a lot of people he talked to didn't call themselves lonely. They said things like, "I have to shoulder all of life's burdens by myself," or "If I disappear tomorrow, no one will even notice." But social disconnection in America is hardly a new thing. Nearly 25 years ago, back in the year 2000, sociologist Robert Putnam published a groundbreaking book called Bowling Alone, in which he described Americans disengaging from the things that kept us connected, like church and social clubs. He hoped we would reverse the trend. Instead, it has accelerated, with online interaction replacing much of our face-to-face connection. And there's no denying the truth in that. But if I can speak personally for just a moment, this enormous concern about loneliness is kind of baffling to me. I spend a lot of time alone. I'm a hardcore introvert, and I just don't feel the need for a lot of social interaction. I rarely feel what I might consider to be lonely. So it seems like there is this real disconnect between my own experience and that of many, many Americans. And it's really got me wondering, what am I missing here? What exactly is lacking for so many people in this country? And more importantly, what's the most useful way to think about this problem of loneliness so we can solve it? Well, that's today on Top of Mind. Dr. Frank Clark, a psychiatrist at Prisma Health Upstate in South Carolina, hears about loneliness from his patients pretty much every day.
I think we have been a lonely nation for quite some time, but we maybe have not come to terms with that. We know that loneliness and social isolation increases your risk for developing depression and anxiety. And so it's not new for me, but I think it's probably new for society, and how do we conceptualize loneliness and social isolation. But I think that this has been something that's been going on for quite some time. I think it's probably come to the surface given that the pandemic happened. So maybe more and more people are experiencing loneliness and social isolation. But I think it's just something that is not talked about. I mean, before the pandemic, it was the hustle and bustle. There's really no time to just sit and be. We are inundated with emails. We are inundated with breaking news. And it's difficult when you are forced, so to speak, when a virus forces you to really say, wait a minute, I don't like the fact that I can't see my family for such and such reason, or I don't like the fact that I have to wear a mask, and this feels very distressing for me. Even with my patients, having to wear a mask, sitting across from them, that can be very isolating. So I think when we're kind of forced to sit and be in discomfort, I think that discomfort can do one of two things. We can wallow in that sorrow that it is, which is fine. But then I think we have to transition and say, okay, there's a reason that we are uncomfortable, and it's okay to sit in that discomfort. But what is that discomfort teaching us, and how do we address it moving forward?
So on the one hand, perhaps during the pandemic, people were experiencing isolation in a way they hadn't before and realized the extent to which they'd taken for granted the amount of connection that they rely on in their lives. So it was a new intensity of loneliness for a prolonged period that kind of hit us in the face for some people.
I would say so. I mean, so I'll give you an example. I happen to be I'm an extrovert. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a huge extrovert, and my energy, I thrive on social connection. I thrive on being with people, fellowshipping with people, breaking bread, and just having a great time. The fact that I was not able to travel for meetings and had meetings virtually, that was very depressing for me. To not be able to give my colleagues a hug or a handshake, right? We know that social connection is healing for the soul, healing for the mind, healing for the body. We release oxytocin, that hormone or the cuddle hormone, or that kind of intimacy hormone that is released even just with a hug, right? So imagine not having that for a year or more. When you're used to that can be very socially isolating. So I think there was an intensity. Now, on the other hand, I think there were some people that were fine with the pandemic if you're more introverted and you don't really thrive on on those.
You can see me smiling broadly here because I was just going to say I cannot relate at all, Dr. Clark, to the experience of like missing social interaction. Like, I mean, occasionally I missed, being able to give my mom a hug,
Sure.
Right? But I did not experience intense loneliness or a sense of lack, really.
No, yeah, I definitely think the pendulum kind of swings in different ways for people. What we do know is that one of the keys to longevity is social connection, right? So even the person who is more introverted, right, would still you may be fine with not having to go to parties, but you still want certain connection, right? So loneliness, the way I would define it is there's this feeling, this subjective feeling of being disconnected. So maybe you are having social connections, but they're not to the level or the quality that you would want them to be.
Okay. So it's an individual sense that I don't have as much as I want.
Yes.
Of social interaction or connectivity.
Yes.
So I could be a total loner and not feel lonely if that meets my needs. Or I could be in a crowd and feel lonely.
Yes.
Or have a ton of friends and still feel lonely. So that's really interesting. So and is that different from social isolation then? Why do we often kind of pair those when we talk about the public health consequences?
Yes, I wouldn't say that they're synonymous. Now, social isolation can contribute to loneliness if, let's say, you have a small number of social connections and maybe you are desiring the quantity be more. And so if you feel like there's a lack of support from others or you're not having those relationships and they're like a smaller number, then that can contribute to loneliness. And I think
Okay.
that's going to be different for everyone, right? So I would say that my friend circle is small. I know a lot of people, but not everybody that I know I would consider to be my friend. And then when you think about social media, right? Let's say, okay, I think on my Facebook account, I have over 1,000 friends. But in reality, like, who am I going to call when I am in distress or things are not going well? Whose shoulder can I cry on? That's going to be probably about 5 or 10 people, and I know who those people are.
Yeah. And that may be enough.
Well, that's definitely enough, right? But I think social media creates a false sense of security because you could have 10,000 followers, but those followers don't all care about you.
So talk to me then, Dr. Clark, about why this is a public health issue, though. Like what merits concern on the level of, obesity or smoking?
Well, and I'll add on that it's associated with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. So when we look at, we may say that, well, how does that happen? A lot of times in society, we tend to have this dichotomy, I believe, between our mental health and our physical health. And in my mind, I think that is dangerous because health is health. There's no separating the mind from the body. They're connected. So let's say that that person has depression. What I share with people is that if you have depression, that increases your risk for developing diabetes.
Because of your behavioral changes?
So a couple of things. Depression presents differently for various people. So people experience it differently. But some of the main symptoms we see in depression could be a decrease in appetite or an increase in appetite. You could have insomnia where you're not sleeping a lot, or you could have hypersomnia where you're sleeping too much. So we know that sleep is important for a number of reasons. Our body has to recover. It has to repair ourselves, right? So when the body's under stress, we have a lot of hormones that are secreted, including cortisol. Our bodies don't want too much cortisol. You don't want too little cortisol. Well, if your body's in a heightened state of anxiety, so to speak, and you're depressed, cortisol can damage our blood vessels, and you can have elevated sugar levels. And so if you have elevated sugar levels, on top of the fact that maybe your appetite is not as good as it once was because instead of consuming nutritious foods, if you're depressed, you're less likely to eat healthy. And if you're less likely to eat healthy, then you're going to have more spikes in your sugars, and then that can result in diabetes.
And so what does it look like to you when a patient comes into your clinic, Dr. Clark, and the problem is loneliness or social isolation? Like how are you able to identify that typically?
So it's rare that they come in and say that, Dr. Clark, I'm feeling lonely. I kind of have to kind of tease that out.
Do you think it's because they don't know it or because they are embarrassed to admit it?
I would say that there's an element of both. I think both are true. But after you're hearing them talk, I will reflect and say, the theme that I'm hearing here, it sounds like you're lonely. And they'll say, yes, that's exactly how I feel. Okay. Now, it may have taken them a while to get there. I mean, they may have just lost their job, or they're going through a divorce, or there could be other things going on. I'll give another example. I have a mother who has been independent the majority of her life, and several years ago, she developed a neurocognitive disorder, a vascular dementia, and now she is in South Carolina in a memory care facility. And she's lonely. She's lonely, even though my family, my wife and daughter and I visit her most Sundays. She's lonely. And I see this a lot with the older population, especially those who are in nursing homes or memory care facilities, because one, people have lost their independence. And it's hard when you are used to functioning independently and then you have a transition in your life, and then there's a role reversal for the children that you have raised that are now taking care of you, and there becomes this sense of I think it becomes very distressing for both parties involved. And how do you navigate that loneliness? How do you navigate that social isolation that could be occurring?
Yeah. Doctor, I'm sorry to hear about that with your mother. I think a lot of us can relate to aspects of that. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm fascinated that you would name that loneliness, because that suggests to me that loneliness is sometimes not just a lack of sort of, interaction with friends or family, but there's I don't know, could you even call it like an existential loneliness, or sort of like a sense of, a disconnectedness from kind of what you want your life to be, or what you remember your life to be, or, feeling a lack, but it's not, I don't know, it's like a disconnectedness that's bigger than just, I don't have my spouse and I don't have my kids in my house, right?
I think so. I mean, to go back to the older adults, there's when we start getting in our 60s and above, we want to know, our goal is, what are we going to pass on to the next generation? How are we contributing? Have we done enough? Are we remaining stagnant, or are we, passing on to the future generations? And if we are not, that can create some loneliness as well. And so I think as we go through the stages of our life, all of us want to have meaning and purpose. And I think when we don't have meaning and purpose at any especially I think in our adolescent years and moving forward, then we kind of ask ourselves, what is my purpose? Like, what, is this life worth living? And at the end of the day, what type of legacy do we want to leave before we transition? These are just at least the things that I think about.
Yeah, yeah. So if we would then maybe refine our definition of loneliness to be an unmet desire for a certain type of connection in a certain amount, right? Because it may also be that you have a lot of of a certain kind of connection that meets a certain kind of need, but you're lacking an intimate connection that also you crave, that leads to a certain sense of loneliness, or it's familial versus friends versus sort of feeling connected to a greater society versus feeling like you have a purpose, kind of like all of that stuff, right? So if it's that subjective, though, and can be so individual and sometimes even hard to recognize or put your finger on, how do you treat it?
Well, so the first thing is, right, with anything, acknowledging that it is what it is, name it. I think we have to name it before anything. But my prescription is first to do an inventory of what does bring you purpose. Because if we ask ourselves what brings us purpose and meaning, then that is a way that we can find that social connection and that we can decrease loneliness. So I'll give you an example, and this is a little bit more self-disclosure. I went through my own depression, clinical depression, when I was in medical school. And I tapped into poetry. That has been a prescription for me, along with seeing my therapist and exercise and my faith in God and the importance that family serves for me. That allows me to decrease loneliness. But if I understand what my patients, what brings them meaning and purpose, then I can inquire a little bit more. So a good example, I've had patients that say, when I'm in my garden, I feel at peace. I don't feel lonely. I don't feel isolated. And they may be the only one in the garden, but in the garden, you're surrounded by tranquility.
It's so fascinating and also just a little befuddling to me, Dr. Clark, because I would think that the first line would be, oh, you don't have enough of the kind of social connection that you crave. Let's figure out who you can call and spend time with. Why is that not the first thing that you turn to? Why is it this purpose piece first?
Because that's a great question. Because I think that one has to understand themselves before they. I mean, I think. Well, my personal opinion, we were created to not be alone. We were created to be in relationships. So I guess I jumped to the piece of what brings meaning and purpose, because if I know that, then maybe I can suggest to my patient, okay, you enjoy bird watching. Have you ever considered joining a bird watching group? They may say, I enjoy rock climbing. Okay, have you ever thought about joining a rock climbing club? If they say, I love to sing, I used to sing in the choir. Hey, are you a member of they say, I belong to a church. Have you ever thought about, auditioning for the church choir? But I think we have to make sure we affirm ourselves and value ourselves first, because if we can value ourselves and know what we like and what we don't like, that will allow us to build, I think, better connections.
Dr. Frank Clark is a board-certified psychiatrist, a professor at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine in Greenville. Thank you so much for your time today, Doctor. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julia. It was a pleasure to fellowship with you, and thanks for the invitation.
And we'll link to some of his poetry in the show notes if you'd like to read it. Now, finding those places to connect with people is not always easy. That is part of what Robert Putnam lamented in his book, Bowling Alone. He was specifically, with that title, pointing to the decline of bowling leagues that apparently played an important role in social connection for a lot of mid-century Americans. In putting this episode together, my producer, James Hoops, got really interested in this idea of third spaces.
Yeah, hey, Julie. So third spaces is actually a term sociologists like to use to describe a place where people are gathering, but it's not your home, it's not your workplace, it's something different. And you're meeting friends there, but also people you might not know and might be different from. And I had this interesting experience when I started college in 2020. This was the pandemic. All my classes were online, and the few that I had in person, we were 6 feet apart. It was the same way at church. Everything was kind of cut short, if it even existed at all.
Oh, that just sounds really isolating. So third spaces just weren't even a thing. There wasn't anything for
Yeah,
you.
like not at all. So you think of college as this time of life where you're meeting a bunch of new friends, you're away from home for the first time. But for me, it was my 3 roommates and 3 people from work, and that was it.
So you had to get creative. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've always been really into movies. I love watching them with my family. I love watching them by myself. And there's this social media platform called Letterboxd, which is this place where you can log the movies you've watched. So there's a little diary, and you can write little reviews and follow all your friends so you can see what they're posting. It's kind of like Goodreads, but for movies. And so I got really involved on that, followed all of my friends, and saw what they were getting up to.
It doesn't sound like it's even remotely, though, like, hey, let's get together and go watch a movie.
Right, and it's totally not. It's super different, but it is a nice way to fill that gap, right? During the pandemic, movie theaters weren't open. So when a new movie would drop on Netflix or on Amazon Prime, I could hop onto Letterboxd and see when all my friends had watched that same movie, read their thoughts, and also connect with strangers and acquaintances and friends of friends who liked movies and connect to them in that way.
Well, it's really interesting, though, because, I think we oftentimes blame the internet and blame social media for kind of killing these IRL, face-to-face third spaces. But in your case, there are clearly ways in which we can connect. I remember during the pandemic, I was actually having a lot of conversations with my siblings on Zoom. Like, we were talking more often than we sometimes did before the pandemic, and
totally.
Thank goodness to the internet for that, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really useful stopgap in that way, but we know for sure today that Americans aren't gathering as much in the traditional spaces, even now that things have opened up again. So church attendance is down. We've seen membership decline in scout troops, in civic groups like Rotary clubs, and even labor unions, right? They've seen big drops in memberships too.
And here we are, of course, in this epidemic of loneliness, according to the U.S. Surgeon General. Perhaps not a coincidence.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we thought it'd be really interesting to talk to someone who's seen a need in their community and who's bucking this trend by opening a gathering place.
Cool. Thanks, James. Well, that's coming up next here on Top of Mind, a BYU Radio podcast. I'm Julie Rose. Hey, Top of Mind listeners, I have another podcast I want to recommend to you. It's from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, and it's called The Appleseed. It's a show filled with stories for you and your family. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories, folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. So it's perfect for road trips, for bedtime, or really anytime you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And the stories you'll hear will likely get your family sharing their own stories with each other, which is really the best part. It's the payoff. So listen to The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts.
So the shop I co-own with my partner Trish is called Elm City Games, and we are based in the Elm City, New Haven, Connecticut.
This is Matt Fantastic. He's also a game designer, even teaches it at some local colleges. Now, Elm City Games isn't just a game store. It's a dedicated space for people to come and play their favorite board games with friends and strangers alike. It's the kind of space Matt Fantastic thought a city like New Haven really needed.
We're definitely on a company town energy, where, Yale and then Yale New Haven Health are the two biggest, employers in the city. Yale itself is just a major global institution that pulls in people from all over the world, all sorts of demographics. So it's pulling in people from all over every spectrum, basically. People are kind of slammed together. And some people here for a long time, some people stay forever, but a lot of people, in and out some amount of years. And so the desire to kind of hang out and do stuff is really strong. And I think people want to meet people and hang out with people. And, games are a great vehicle to do that.
Now, I have lived in cities like that and never thought about opening a gathering place. But Matt Fantastic is a born extrovert and comes from a family of natural connectors.
We were definitely growing up a house that people would visit. We lived with my mom and my grandparents, and my grandparents' friends would come by, my mom's friends would come by. So we were always one of those spaces. My adolescence and early years were playing in bands and booking shows at my grandmother's house. And we'd pack the basement out, right? And it was really fun because we'd have a band like Against Me would be on tour playing these big venues, and then they'd have a day off and would play my grandmother's basement, that kind of thing. That built-in community aspect has been a big part of my life, so it's kind of a natural extension of that.
Talk to me about what made you think, let's open a game shop.
Yeah, well, so I'd already had a career as a designer and sort of like working in the game industry, and simultaneous to that, I'd been running a large meetup group. This was still, when meetup was still like a really thriving thing. And so, I've made some of my best friends via games. And there was definitely this, like, we can have this cool community vibe, and we can do cool stuff. And that social aspect was definitely an important part of it from the very beginning. But initially it was really just, we want a cool spot to, hang out and play games and, help people make friends and meet each other.
Elm City Games opened in 2016 in the back of a friend's cafe.
We moved, a ton of my game collection in there, and we had over 600 people show up to our opening day.
Why were all those people showing up? What were those 600 people there for on opening day?
Yeah. Well, so, I think part of it is the larger, nerdy ascension, right? Like video games became more and more mainstream. D&D is like a huge brand that everybody knows. Your grandma knows what D&D vaguely is, has heard of it. They may not play it or anything.
Dungeons and Dragons, just in case
Dungeons
people...
and Dragons, everybody knows. So there's like a larger interest, I think, for sure, in that kind of like game curious. The nature of tabletop games as well is that, it sort of requires a physical space. It requires meeting up with people. It requires sitting across a table from someone and doing the thing. So there's sort of a natural need for that kind of physical space to meet up at.
Eventually, Elm City Games outgrew the cafe and got its own space. And Matt Fantastic has experimented with different business models. Selling food, for example, turned out to be more work than it was worth. He says a membership model, along with some retail, has been successful.
So we do $10 for day passes and $20 for a monthly membership. When you have a membership, if you're like, well, I play D&D, I come, I have a membership because I'm there, once a week to play D&D, but hey, it's a Tuesday, there's nothing going on. Let me swing by the shop and see what's happening. We'll have people just, show up with a six-pack and see who's here and, who wants to get in a game of whatever, and so we intentionally make that membership very cheap if you're planning to come here with any regularity, because then that drop-in and that sort of casual hangout becomes just an easy add-on.
Yeah. Tell me a little more about that. Do you, what are they not getting at home and at work or school, if that's where you're spending your time, right? That they feel like they need to come to Elm City?
We're very social humans, generally speaking. And also, a lot of people are happy to hang out with people they don't know particularly well if it's a sort of public comfortable space versus I'm going to just invite a bunch of weirdos over and maybe they're cool. Not even getting into like, oh, some people are terrible or anything. Just, different people have different vibes. And so here, we have a space that people can come into and they can meet people. And, we have a lot of people that come less. Actually, they started coming a ton. Then they kind of made friends and built a friend group. And, they do other stuff than just hang out here now, and they'll all go apple picking or, whatever, that kind of stuff. And so we are also kind of a really good social lubricant in that way. You sit down, you play a game. If we're not vibing, that's fine. We'll do the game and we focus on that.
So do you see a lot of sort of cross-cutting interaction? Like here, like people are coming that would normally never sort of interact or have a way to interact or a reason or even choose to interact, but then, they're kind of able to sort of get outside of their bubbles.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I think is really big, for example, is that we are frequently the first public space that people are out. I'm middle-aged. There's also, some older people, and they're like, well, I don't encounter a bunch of 20-year-old trans kids in my day-to-day life. But, I play D&D with some, and okay, there's a little bit of bridge building there for sure, where people are sort of interacting with people that they're not necessarily going to as much. And the same thing in the flip direction where, there's a bunch of 20-year-old trans kids that are like, oh, man, 50-year-olds. They're all, squares that are, down on everything and whatever. And then they're like, oh, actually, this guy's cool. Like, or, oh, I thought that one was going to be a grump. Actually, she's a delight. And if you're interacting with each other, you're generally, oh, okay, yeah, you're a person sitting there across the table from me. It's difficult for me to think of you as an abstract concept.
So what do you think when you hear, like news reports or see headlines or people like us call you and say like, there's this loneliness epidemic. Are you like, yeah, I totally see that? Or it's like, interesting.
No, I definitely see it. There's people that have been, I moved here and I didn't know anyone and I was just so isolated and lonely and, I came here for work and I'm not clicking with any of the people I work with in that way. And, I was just sitting at home being sad all the time. And then, I came over here and was like, oh, let me check this out. And now I have a friend group. Now I have, we've had a bunch of couples that met coming to, game nights or game events and now they're married. We have people that have moved away, but then still come back to visit friends here and, come hang out here, even though they haven't been here in a long time. And so, I definitely see the change that we've affected and the impact we've had on people. We've had a lot of people get jobs. And, one person in particular, I remember, he moved here with his wife, who was got a job at Yale, and he was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I need a job. I don't know. And, this is the kind of stuff I do. And I remember this one well because, it was me. I was like, oh, I got to introduce you to this guy who comes here all the time. Like he runs a company that does like exactly that. And, a week later he worked there and that was his career here was 100% the result of, showing up to D&D here one night and just mentioning, oh, I'm new and I need a job.
Matt Fantastic is the co-owner of Elm City Games in New Haven, Connecticut. He's a game designer himself. Matt, this has been really fun. Thank you so much for taking time with me today.
Yeah, happy to do it. And, I love talking about this stuff.
I can tell. And I'm sitting here thinking, do you have any word game tables? I've often thought lately, I'm like, what I really want is a place that I can go every day after work for like a half an hour and play Wordle with people. Like I do my Wordle and it's like my thing that makes me happy every day. And I'm like, but I need it to be communal and I want to connect with other word nerds just for like 10, 15, 20 minutes every day. So.
Yeah. Well, what I would encourage you to reach out to a local spot and say, hey, can I start a
Wordle meetup every day?
Yeah, the reality is that, you are, it can be tough, and this is sort of, I'll say this to everybody, that's listening and everything, it can be tough to get that inertia going, but if you want it and it's something you're interested in, guaranteed there are a good number of other people that would love to join you. So even though it can seem really daunting and overwhelming, and you might have to grind it out for a bit where you and your friend are the only people that show up for the first few or whatever, that there are people out there interested. You can make that connection. Anyone can build that community. You don't need to own a game store to do that stuff. People want that third space. They want that community. And whatever your interest is, there's definitely other people that are interested in it.
Okay, word nerds, should we do it? Now look, loneliness, it turns out, serves a biological purpose. Neuroscientists have started thinking of loneliness more like hunger or thirst. It's an important signal to the body that something's not right. So what if we spent some time listening to it?
Since it is something that I believe we can't ever really get rid of completely, it makes sense to me to be more comfortable with it and see it as a companion instead of something to run from or something to avoid.
Our next guest feels loneliness a little differently, and she thinks about it in a way that actually really connected some dots for me. It could also open some new avenues for addressing loneliness in society. So that's next on Top of Mind, a BYU Radio podcast. I'm Julie Rose. If you're looking for a podcast the whole family can enjoy together, check out the new show Constant Wonder Kids. It takes stories from the BYU Radio original podcast Constant Wonder and transforms them so kids can join in on the adventure. Together you can discover fascinating facts and true stories about amazing people doing incredible things in nature, like diving deep into the ocean to meet an unexpectedly friendly whale shark, or cheering for tiny athletes at the International Hedgehog Olympics. Yeah, I said hedgehog. Constant Wonder Kids is perfect for road trips, bedtime, or when your brain's got an itch that needs to be scratched. New episodes drop Mondays, and you can find Constant Wonder Kids on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, all the podcast apps. Charlotte Donlin has always felt a little out of place.
I've never been comfortable being put in a box, and I think people who are on the periphery feel a little lonely.
Donlin is the writer and spiritual director we heard from earlier. Her book is called The Great Belonging: How Loneliness Leads Us to Each Other.
Even growing up, I always was friends with different types of groups. I was friends with the athletes. I was friends with the cheerleaders. I was friends with the nerds. And I had my few very good friends, but I never just kind of stuck with one clique. And I think my inability to do that led me and still leads me to feel a little bit separated from people or from a sense of belonging.
Belonging is an important concept for Donlin, and it's a big reason that I wanted to talk to her too. She is surprisingly open about her own loneliness, and she's done a lot of thinking and writing about what to do with it.
So when I wrote The Great Belonging, I was super concerned about making sure no one thought I was trying to solve the problem of loneliness, because I don't think it can necessarily be solved. I think it shifts and ebbs and flows, and sometimes it's horrible, and sometimes it's not that bad to feel lonely. And while I don't want people to suffer from loneliness, and while chronic loneliness is definitely something that needs, I believe, like medical attention and help from a mental health professional, the normal amount of loneliness most people have is kind of a part of life.
How do you define loneliness then?
Yeah, for me, it's about belonging, and it's about, I love to be alone. It's not necessarily being alone and away from people or practicing solitude or that sort of thing. For me, it's this core sense of being separated, either from myself, other people, or the divine. I'm a Christian, so I wrote that first book, and most of my writing is from like a Christian framework. And for me, those main three areas of belonging to the self, belonging to others, and belonging to God are always sort of being negotiated. And I'm checking in constantly, or a few times a day, honestly, about how am I? How am I with myself and with others and with God? One thing I've discovered since that book came out, and what I think I was touching on while I was writing the book, is that we can always belong more. We can always broaden our belongings. We can always discover and explore what works for us as individuals and as groups, maybe as a family or a neighborhood or a congregation. Like, what are the things that help us belong to ourselves, others, and the broader world? And how can we put ourselves in the way of those things, growing our belongings, even while we may be suffering from loneliness?
Is there an experience that you can think of that sort of explains what it feels like to have a lack of belonging, and what worked to increase your sense of belonging?
Yeah. I mean, I could tell you a dozen examples, but I'll start with one. So one way a lot of people experience loneliness is when they lose a loved one. And my dad died in August of 2020 from complications with COVID. And on the second anniversary of his death, I woke up, it was August 6th. We're coming out of COVID. Things are a bit normal. And I just didn't want to be sad. I was like, I've grieved a lot. I am okay grieving. I'm good at grieving, but I want to have a good day. How can I have a good day? And what I did was I started at the public library, and I checked out about 20 of those big fat art books that you don't buy because they're so expensive, but the library has a ton of them. And it was kind of like a workout to get them to my car, but I checked out 20 of them and they were piled up in my car. And then I went to our public museum at the Birmingham Art Museum, which is close to the library location I was at. And I walked around for about an hour and a half and visited some of my favorite artworks that, I call my art friends, because I kind of return to the same ones again and again sometimes. And then I went and got coffee at a favorite coffee shop where I'm kind of a regular and they know me, they know my name. I went for a walk in the neighborhood that we lived in when my dad died and listened to some of his favorite music. And then I came home and I was happy and I had a good day. So for me, art and engaging with different forms of art is a way that I belong, that I find belonging.
Belong to who? Belong to
myself, to my dad, to my community, being a regular at that one coffee shop. I think a lot of us are doing practices for belonging without calling it practices for belonging. But when we're intentional about the language we use and the things we do with our time for the purpose of greater belonging, we, I think, receive more benefits from it. I read some research recently that said our brains do the same things when we engage with art that our brains do when we engage with people. So the same sort of neural pathways are firing, the same parts of the brain are firing. But I was like, of course, there's a scientific explanation for this thing that's very true and real for me and my experience.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you identified that sentiment on the second anniversary of your dad's death as loneliness instead of sadness or grief.
Well, I missed him, so I'm okay with grief. I mean, I'm okay with loneliness. And I think there's probably more than one thing happening on that day, right? There's more than one thing that the art is meeting me in.
Oh, well, another thing that's kind of striking to me about that is that it was a day filled with quite a bit of solitude. You weren't, you were sort of in public places, but I would initially think of loneliness as a certain human-to-human connection that I'm lacking. And you're describing this more as a sense of connection, I guess. And then you can experience that sense of connection by engaging with art and engaging with memories of your dad, none of which have to do with actually engaging with other people. I mean, that's fascinating to me.
Right. I love to engage with art with other people. I don't always need to be alone when I'm engaging with art to feel less lonely, but I often do.
Now, Charlotte Donlin is a Christian. And as a spiritual director, which is kind of like a life coach or a counselor, she works with people of all faiths on their spiritual health and goals. And that makes her sensitive to another experience of loneliness.
This sort of loneliness that's a soul level of loneliness of not being one with God right now on this side of eternity. You know, knowing on a deep level that this is not my ultimate home, and this place that we inhabit is broken in so many ways and not what it's supposed to be. That honestly is one of the forms of loneliness I struggle with most.
And it's something that she has worked on with her own spiritual director.
Like, if I am lonely and if I've struggled with this my whole life, what does that say about God's presence in my life? Like, that it didn't mean God was bad or God was absent, or that I was bad or not spiritual enough, or that sort of thing. And my spiritual director at one point was like, have you ever thought about the loneliness of Jesus? And I was like, no, but that's a perfectly great thing to consider. And just the idea of being man and God on earth full of people who were not man and God was probably pretty isolating, you know, and then being around people who didn't know what was going on half the time, even though you had just told them what was going on, and being, you know, alone in the garden, you know, feeling forsaken on the cross. Not that my loneliness is anything what Jesus had, you know, experienced, but knowing and reframing and re-looking at the life of Jesus from a lens of loneliness and belonging was super helpful to me.
What was helpful about that?
Like, I'm not alone in my loneliness. And even if no human gets it or understands or whatever, like, it, you know how there are scriptures and theology of how Jesus has experienced everything we've experienced. And that always felt kind of, you know, not super applicable to me as a woman and as someone with mental illness. But when it came to loneliness, I was like, oh, yeah, you got this. You know, it just really, it made me feel seen and known more so by Jesus. And now I kind of talk to God about it, like hanging out. It's a very common topic of conversation. And loneliness in general for me is very, I'm more comfortable with it when I experience it and feel it. I'm more okay with it.
Yeah. So is loneliness divine?
I think it's part of the divine experience.
Would you go so far as to say it's a gift?
You know, it's hard for me to call hard things gifts, but I think it can be a good thing that can give us good things.
What would your guidance be then for someone who is experiencing loneliness, this sense of a lack of belonging or lack of the kind of connection that they crave?
Since it is something that I believe we can't ever really get rid of completely, it makes sense to me to be more comfortable with it and see it as a companion in a way, instead of something to run from or something to avoid. I do think loneliness can take us deeper into our belongings. I think most people who discover they're lonely will need to be more thoughtful about giving it some time and space to consider and slow down and pause.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think this idea of taking a slow, curious approach to loneliness, I guess, do you think there's a risk in, like, is it wrong to sort of quickly try to fix it? I'm feeling really lonely. I'm going to go out in public, or I'm going to call a friend,
right.
or I'm going to like do whatever it takes to kind of eliminate this feeling.
You know, I think if you're struggling with loneliness and you're having a bad day, you don't have energy to pause and journal and be contemplative about the whole thing. If you know rewatching Ted Lasso will make you feel better, please rewatch Ted Lasso. I think there's room for both. I'm kind of permissive in that way of like, all the things can be good things. All of the responses can be good responses. But if you notice that you're always running from it or always trying to make yourself feel better, it might be good to, set apart a couple hours when you have the time and really explore it more. And maybe journal about their thoughts and feelings about it. It doesn't have to be beautiful writing. They can just take a few notes. I think talking to someone who feels safe and who will hold their loneliness carefully.
How would you start that conversation? We've already established that it can be really vulnerable to acknowledge that something's lacking in your life. Yeah. And we're sort of conditioned to feel like it's our fault, right?
I mean, I think a good starting point might be to ask, have you ever felt lonely? If you're the one that wants to talk about your loneliness, maybe ask the person you're with if they felt it and maybe see what their response is. And if they give you a shocked look, you can maybe have the courage to say, well, I do sometimes, and this is how I've noticed it, and I'm not really sure what to do with it. I do think it's important to be okay with not knowing what to do with it. Like, be okay with not knowing all of the answers and not feeling like you have to have it figured out. And I think that is the obstacle to so much of our interpersonal belonging, with friends or in our places of worship. People, when we think we have to have all the answers, it's hard to be honest about the reality that we're experiencing. So if we see it as an opportunity to have a conversation with someone else about their loneliness, now we're belonging. We're already belonging because we're having this important conversation with someone who feels safe, someone who cares about us. And as we're talking about it, we're realizing it has less power over us.
I have to say that this conversation and your take on loneliness has been really eye-opening to me, because I am a hardcore introvert, and I just don't experience loneliness in the sense that I don't crave having other people around me. And I don't crave social, face-to-face social interaction or even phone calls. That just, I'm very, very content on my own, most comfortable in a lot of cases on my own. But I do, if I name it connection, and if that can come in ways it can be connection to lots of things, to a sense of something bigger than myself, to a higher power, to sort of a community online, or to kind of like-minded people who all like the same TV show, and so we're all kind of watching it. I don't know, right? There's lots, or art, like you said, or people who've passed on, that I can totally identify with, and feel a lot. But I just never would have labeled it loneliness.
And, I don't want to say that all of those things are always loneliness, right? A lot can be happening. We're complex people, but I bet some of it has to do with connection and disconnection. And what is it when you feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself, through your work and through your podcast and that sort of thing. So I love that. And I hope you continue to recognize and discover new things about it.
Charlotte Donlan is the author of The Great Belonging, How Loneliness Leads Us to Each Other. She's a spiritual director and has a podcast called Hope for the Lonely. Thank you so much for your time today, Charlotte.
Thank you for having me. It was so good to talk to you.
So, you heard the journey this episode took me on, and I would love to hear what resonated with you. Send an email to topofmind@byu.edu. Let's connect. You can also connect with me and the show on social media. Look for Top of Mind Pod. And while you're at it, be sure to check out my other podcast, Uncomfy, where we explore what it means to lean into moments that challenge us, to perspectives that bump up against the way we see the world. And we consider why it's worth the discomfort. How do we do it? And what do we get from it? You can watch Uncomfy on YouTube and Spotify. It's a video podcast, or you can listen on your favorite app. Top of Mind is a BYU Radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Vanessa Goodman and James Hoops, with help from Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Brendan Lewis and Lauren Sandberg are our audio engineer and sound design team. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.